Hello everybody, my name is Happy and I'd like to welcome you all to my History Reaction channel. Today is Sunday, so we're heading back for some more Caesar. Specifically, we're going to be looking at Caesar in Britain, Part 2, There and Back Again, a Hobbit's Holiday, a Roman holiday, something like that. Anyway, this is by Historia Civilis, and I will include a link to the original video in the description down below. If you like what you see here, please head over to Historia Civilis, watch the video there, or otherwise show some love and support for the hard work they put into this series. I've been loving it so far. It's a good mix of the politics and the military. Doesn't go too deep on either one, but it does give you the good overview of it all. I mentioned this in the last video, but back in high school, I did translate the entire Caesar's Gallic campaign during 3 years of Latin. Yay. I survived it, believe it or not. The part that I remember the most, other than the opening, all of Gaul is divided into 3 parts, is the book 4 and 5, when he talked about his expedition to Britain. The 2 of them. So, this is the one part of this that I remember the best, which isn't saying a lot. It's still a good, 40 years ago, give or take. So, that's not saying much, but let's get into this and see what he got to say today.
Last year, Caesar became the first Roman general to lead an army to the island of Britain. But the expedition flirted with catastrophe and didn't accomplish a whole lot. This year, Caesar was determined to return. And this time, he was going to do it right. One big problem he faced was the Roman ships. They sucked. Caesar had a new ship designed, incorporating elements used by the Veneti and other Gallic tribes. The
Roman ships didn't suck. They just weren't made for the Atlantic. They were made for the Mediterranean. The Atlantic has an entirely different character than the Mediterranean. Ships that work well in the Mediterranean don't work as well in the Atlantic, and vice versa. So what he ends up doing is redesigning the ships, like he just said. He said they based it on a Gallic design. Actually, if I remember the journals, he actually designed it himself. He doesn't talk about borrowing it from the Gauls. He talked about what he needs and how that translates into the ship that he wants. So, he talked about, for example, the difference between the tide for what they're used to. So he wants a ship that is shallower and wider so they can handle embarking and disembarking cavalry, for example. Things like that. So that's what he actually ends up doing. He comes up with ships suited for what he wants to have done over here. And at the same time, also better suited for the Atlantic than the ships that he had before. Alright, continuing.
Over the winter, Caesar put his entire army to work, building as many of these ships as possible.
Right.
He left them under Labienus's watchful eye, as he returned to Cisalpine Gaul to put in some face time as governor.
Right.
The next spring, after dealing with a minor uprising in Illyricum, Caesar made his way back up to northern Gaul. He sent messages to every friendly tribe in Gaul, asking each to contribute a small group of cavalry to the expedition, and insisting that each group be led by its tribal leadership.
Yes.
This served 3 purposes. First, the majority of the Roman army was going to be gone for most of the campaigning season, and having most of Gaul's leadership with them would be useful if there was any sort of uprising. Second, he now knew that the Britons fought primarily with cavalry, and the Romans were pretty weak in that department. Third, rival tribes from all over Gaul coming together and uniting under the Roman banner was some powerful symbolism.
Yep.
Caesar's request made some of the Gauls pretty angry, but in the end, they delivered. And
he does do this, and this is... The big thing is he asks for them to send their best leaders. And like they said, a big part of that was to have the leadership with him so that if... the tribes try to rebel while he's gone. He got hostages and some of their leaders. So the other factor in this is he said that Caesar's taking most of his troops. He's still going to leave at least, I want to say, 3 legions and a unit of cavalry behind as well. So he doesn't take them all. That's a good 15,000 men, give or take.
4,000 Gallic cavalry showed up at the Roman camp. Caesar split his new Gallic cavalry into two groups.
Right.
Half would come with him to Britain, and the other half would stay with Labienus in Gaul.
Right. Yeah, and you can see it right here. He takes 5 with him, he leaves 3 with Labienus. Plus, each get half the cavalry.
Everything was ready. If all went according to plan, Caesar would be invading with 27,000 men. Last year, he'd been forced to make do with 8,000. This
not necessarily. He never gives a number. What he does is he says he takes 5 legions with him, plus the cavalry. Now, a legion would normally have a little over 5,000 men. I think it's, 5,280 or something like that. No, that's a number of miles, but it's something close to that anyway. Same ballpark, number of feet in a mile, but it's in the same ballpark. I don't remember exactly, but it's a little bit over 5,000 per legion. And that'll give you approaching around 27,000. But that's if the legion is full. We talked about this in a previous video. Throughout history, when you're talking about units, corps, all of that, they have an ideal strength, what they're supposed to be at, and the real strength, what they are actually at. The real strength is usually lower than the normal ideal strength, sometimes significantly lower. So he had up to around 27,000 men. It was probably less than that, potentially significantly less, but I doubt lower than 20,000, but it would have been lower.
This was a massive step up. The Romans set sail for Britain.
Let's go back and make sure
with 8,000. This was a massive step up.
Oh yeah.
The Romans set sail for Britain. Again. Caesar's plan was to land on the same beach as last year. The fleet arrived by midday, but this time there was nobody there to greet them.
One thing that I wanted to add that I just thought of is when he was designing these boats, he has transports built. So a significant number of these boats, I think about 600 were transports. And then he had like 28, warships. So this time he's got a lot of transports with him, which is what he needs for what he's wanting to do, an amphibious landing.
The Romans disembarked, and the infantry got busy building their fortified encampment, while scouts on horseback fanned out to do some reconnaissance. Sometime later, the scouts returned. From what they could tell, there had been an army here only hours earlier, and there were tracks heading inland. There was still some daylight left, so Caesar ordered 4 of his 5 legions and his mounted Gallic allies to prepare to march, while the remaining legion and a small group of cavalry stayed behind with the ships. Caesar pushed his men hard, and they kept marching straight through the night. As the sun rose the next day, they caught sight of their foe. The enemy army had crossed the river and was in the process.
Did I say 600 ships earlier? He built 600 ships, supposedly, according to his documents. However, he also brought ships he already had, so I think the total naval force was about 800.
Process of falling back into the woods. In the woods, there was a wooden fort atop a hill. The Romans hadn't slept and were dead on their feet, but nevertheless, they began to ford the river. As the Romans advanced toward the woods, the Britons sent their chariots and cavalry forward to slow them down. In response, Caesar sent his own cavalry forward, which included his 2,000 mounted Gallic allies. The Romans smashed into the chariots, which sent them into total disarray. The beaten chariots and cavalry retreated back into the woods. The Roman infantry were now free to advance up the hill, but as they made their ascent, they realized that there were Britons hiding in the woods beside them.
Oh dear.
The Britons attacked, but the Roman heavy infantry were able to swat them away and continue up the hill. As they approached the fort, the Romans were met with missile fire. The infantry got into their testudo, or tortoise formation, where the soldiers got close together and raised their shields to form a protective shell, and continued to slowly move forward. While protected like this, most missiles bounced off harmlessly. Once they reached the walls of the fort, the infantry quickly piled up some dirt to make a crude ramp. Then, the Romans ascended the ramp and jumped down into the British fort.
common Roman tactic is to build the dirt ramps for sieges,
causing general mayhem. Once the Britons realized that their walls were breached, they didn't put up much of a fight, and quickly fell back into the woods. The Romans were eager to pursue, but Caesar thought better of it, fearing that this was all a prelude to a massive ambush. Besides, his men hadn't slept since leaving Gaul. He had them quickly throw together their fortified encampment and let them rest until the next day. The next morning, Caesar ordered 3 of his 4 legions to fan out in search of the enemy. They had instructions to burn and raze any villages they came across. This, in theory, would draw the Britons out and pressure them to face Caesar in a set-piece battle. Caesar remained in camp with his remaining legion, presumably ready to rush to the aid of his men if they happened to stumble across an army. Later that day, one of the legions caught sight of the enemy army and sent word to Caesar. But, around the same time, another messenger arrived from the Roman camp back on the beach.
Oh boy.
Apparently, the previous night, almost all of the ships anchored offshore were caught in a storm. According to the messenger, many of the ships were damaged beyond repair. If this sounds familiar, it's because a similar thing happened to Caesar last year.
I don't think that's what it said, though. If I remember right, it said that they were forced to return to dock. Let me check. I'm curious about this. That's not how I remember the story going, but like I said, it's over 40 years now. But for some reason, the Briton attack fascinated me. Probably, so I paid extra attention while I was translating it. Probably because, unlike all the other battles, he's really struggling here, which made it more interesting. Okay, so it looks like Historia Civilis is right, but what I'm remembering is also in the journal in this same book. So before he left, there was a storm, and 40 ships were forced to return to the docks to be repaired. And then later, in the event that they're talking about right here, another storm hits and another 40 ships. That's what confused me, because both of these storms during this invasion of Britain, one forces 40 ships to return to dock. The second one actually dashes them against the rocks or against the shore and other ships, is what it actually says. So, pretty serious storm. So, what I was remembering is actually there, and it is part of this expedition, but Historia Civilis hadn't mentioned that one. That one happens right before they leave, and then this one happens shortly after they arrive. So, they got it right. So, I'm glad I checked.
Caesar now had a decision to make. On one hand, he had an enemy army within his grasp. On the other, his men were now stranded on the island, and decisions needed to be made back on the beach. After some consideration, he sent messengers to each of his 3 legions in the field, telling them to come back to camp. He would play it safe and march his entire army back to the beach. When Caesar arrived, he had all of the ships dragged up on shore so that he could have a look at them.
Right.
The damage wasn't nearly as bad as initially reported. His fleet had consisted of 600 ships, and true, most were damaged, but only...
It was actually higher than that, closer to 800. Now, I think I'm sure about that. The confusion here is that at the beginning he does say Caesar built 600 ships for this expedition. That number is what he built for the expedition. But as I said earlier, he had other ships that had already been part of his force in existence. Those ships didn't just disappear. So the total fleet size was closer to 800.
40 were damaged beyond repair. This was still bad, but Caesar was in luck, because his legions had been the ones who had actually built these ships. Pretty much every person in his army had some shipbuilding experience. Caesar organized hundreds of repair crews, and got them started patching up the ships. He then spent the next 10 days having the rest of his army build a very long wall, running all the way from the fortified camp down to the water. His repair crews had a lot of work ahead of them, but this wall would keep them safe from attack. With his ships seen to, and his repair crews hard at work, Caesar was eager to continue his campaign. He left 1 legion and a small group of cavalry behind, same as before, and marched off with the other 4 legions. The Britons had used this break in the action to get their act together. The tribes had finally united behind a man named Cassivellaunus, and had entrusted him with the command of a coalition army, tasked with defending the island from the Roman invaders. This time, when Caesar marched inland, the Britons didn't mess around. Throughout the day, the legions were constantly harassed by hit-and-run attacks from chariots and cavalry, who, when pursued, quickly fled into the woods. At one point, the Roman cavalry charged after them, only to run straight into a nasty ambush. Late in the day, the frustrated Romans stopped to build their fortified encampment. The Britons had been waiting for this moment, and charged out of the woods, descending on the vulnerable Romans. You can tell that the Britons were finally under the command of somebody who knew what they were doing. It was standard practice for a portion of the Roman army to stand guard while the camp was being built, and it's a good thing, because they were the only soldiers in a position to respond as the British attacked. Caesar gave instructions for half of his army to hold the Britons off, while the other half continued construction. They would need those walls finished, just in case the fighting turned bad and they needed to withdraw.
Right.
As the two sides met, the fighting was pretty brutal. The Romans were exhausted, and the Britons knew it. As the fighting continued, the chariots were starting to do some real damage. The Britons loved to do fake retreats, and whenever they could bait the Roman infantry into breaking formation and running after them, the chariots would stop, the riders would step down onto the ground, and within seconds, the out-of-formation Romans would find themselves charging into a solid wall of infantry. But on the other hand, if the Roman infantry stood their ground and resisted the urge to charge, the Britons simply seized control of the battlefield and were free to hit the Romans with their javelins from any direction. The chariots never fought as one cohesive group, so it was very hard for the Romans to adopt one strategy to deal with them. When one group retreated, another would charge. When one stepped down to fight the Romans on foot, another would unexpectedly swoop in from the side. The Roman army was primarily heavy infantry and was not built to fight like this. Eventually, the Britons were able to break through the Roman center. This was catastrophic. The Roman line was collapsing. Caesar responded by quickly sending 2 cohorts, or 1,000 men, to reinforce the line. As the fresh infantry flooded in and re-established control of the center, the British chariots backed off, and the army withdrew. The Romans had successfully fended the Britons off, but this was no victory. They had only narrowly avoided disaster, and in the process lost way too many men. The next morning, the Britons deployed for battle opposite the Romans, and sent raiding parties to mess with the Roman cavalry, trying to bait them into doing something stupid. They didn't fall for it. By midday, nothing was happening, so the Britons withdrew. Caesar didn't pursue them. When they were gone, Caesar sent 3 of his legions out with all of his cavalry to forage for food, while he held down the fort with the remaining legion. The Britons must have been lying in wait for something like this to happen, because once the 3 legions were away from the camp, they were ambushed. Hard. So hard that Caesar specifically mentions that the legions almost lost their eagle standards during the initial attack, but the Romans quickly got themselves organized and responded. As the Roman infantry pushed back, the British cavalry and chariots fell into a fake retreat. But this time, the Roman cavalry surged forward and kept the pressure on the chariots. Under constant threat from the Roman cavalry, the chariot drivers were unable to get down and fight on foot as they had before. Eventually, the fake retreat turned into a real one. This was a small victory, but at least it was a victory. Caesar decided that this would be a good time to reevaluate his entire strategy for the invasion. The British chariots were just too fast and too slippery, and were able to easily disengage at the first sign of trouble. This would make it very difficult for Caesar to win one decisive victory, so instead, Caesar decided to target Cassivellaunus' homeland, just north of the Thames River. At worst, this would pressure Cassivellaunus to face Caesar in a big set-piece battle, creating the opportunity for Caesar to win one decisive victory. At best, it would erode Cassivellaunus' base of support, eliminating the need for a decisive victory at all. With his mind made up, Caesar marched north. As he approached the Thames River, he could see Cassivellaunus' army on the other side. The river was deep, but not too deep to ford. Caesar sent his cavalry across first, the infantry followed behind. The cavalry weathered the British missile fire as they slowly made their way across the river. At this moment, the Romans were lucky to have their 2,000 mounted Gallic allies with them, because they were really good at this sort of thing. They were able to push in and establish a beachhead for themselves, and as the Roman infantry began to reinforce them, the Britons yielded and fell back. Caesar was now in Cassivellaunus' territory. He began to execute his strategy, systematically razing villages and burning crops. Cassivellaunus trailed the Roman army, but decided not to directly challenge them with a set-piece battle. Whenever the Romans went out to forage, he relentlessly attacked them with his chariots. After a few incidents, Caesar was forced to stop foraging, and instead began to rely on the small amount of food he brought with him. Cassivellaunus watched helplessly as the Romans continued to ravage the countryside. And then, in an instant, the nature of the campaign changed dramatically. The leader of one of the largest tribes serving under Cassivellaunus' banner showed up unexpectedly at the Roman camp. He told Caesar that he was open to allying his tribe with the Romans, if Caesar would, in return, protect his lands from Cassivellaunus. Clearly, Caesar's campaign of destruction was having an effect, and making some of Cassivellaunus' allies worried. Caesar said that, yes, he would agree to those terms, so long as the tribe agreed to surrender some hostages and supply the Romans with food. Without the ability to forage, Caesar was quickly burning through his supplies. The tribal leader agreed, and just like that, Rome had an ally. And then, as if they were waiting in the wings, 5 more tribes came forward, ready to defect on similar terms. Caesar happily agreed. The fact that Cassivellaunus was now losing allies left and right was great, but what was even better was the amazing intelligence that Caesar's new allies turned over. They told him everything. They told him that Cassivellaunus had been stockpiling grain and cattle, and had enough food hidden away to keep the war going indefinitely. They told him that Cassivellaunus was down to 4,000 chariots, which was a lot less than what he started with. And they told him that Cassivellaunus was operating out of a secret stronghold, hidden deep in the woods. They agreed to show Caesar where it was. Caesar arrived at the location of this supposed hidden fortress, and then marched blindly into the woods. As he advanced, chariots hit the Roman column with increasing intensity. Caesar knew better than to let his men get distracted and chase them off into the woods, but nevertheless, the constant attacks inflicted significant losses. And then, finally, the Romans could see the hidden stronghold. This, reportedly, was home to most of Cassivellaunus' army, as well as all of the supplies that he would need if he wanted to continue the war. Caesar divided his army in 2, and had them approach the stronghold from 2 different angles. He had no way of knowing how well these walls would be defended. The Britons pelted them with missiles as they approached, but by the time the Romans reached the walls, the Britons were already beginning to lose faith and abandon the stronghold. When the Romans breached the walls, there was a bit of fighting, but it was over pretty quickly. The Britons left their stockpiles behind as the army slipped out of the fort and fled even deeper into the woods. As the British army was retreating, Cassivellaunus sent a message to some of his allies in southern Britain, who had been waiting for a signal from him. He gave them the signal they were waiting for, and all of a sudden, a new army materialized and began marching toward the Roman ships. The Romans had no idea. This new British army attacked the Roman camp, but the defending Romans, luckily, had this defensive wall going all the way down to the water. They quickly repulsed the first wave by throwing their javelins over the walls and defending the entrance. After this initial contact, they probably got the impression that this new British army was kinda green, because their next move was to recklessly charge out of the camp, directly into the British line, which immediately caused a full rout. That was Cassivellaunus' last move. It was a good idea on paper, but it failed, and he had no more tricks up his sleeve. With his own territory in ruins, and with all of his armies chased from the field, he sent a peace offer to Caesar. By this time it was September, and Caesar needed to start thinking about getting off the island, so he let Cassivellaunus off easy. Caesar demanded some hostages and forbade Cassivellaunus from waging war against Rome's new British allies, but that was it. Cassivellaunus agreed, and Caesar returned to the coast. It was time to leave, and Caesar was pleased to find that most of his ships had been repaired. But remember, he had lost 40 ships earlier in the year, and was now weighed down with extra hostages and slaves. There was no way he could squeeze his entire army onto his remaining ships. He decided that he would make 2 trips, taking half of his army across at a time. They picked the sturdiest transports, and loaded half of the army into them. Caesar chose to stay behind and come with the second group. The ships departed, and the crossing went well. But as they reached the Gallic coast and disembarked, the winds picked up, temporarily preventing the ships from sailing back to Britain. Caesar was now in serious trouble. If the ships didn't return soon, he would be stranded on Britain for the winter, with only half of his army and virtually no food. He didn't have any good ideas, so he took another look at the ships that had been declared damaged beyond repair. Anything was better than starving to death on this godforsaken island, so he picked the best of the lot and decided to roll the dice. If they were lucky, maybe they would reach the continent before the ship sank. They set off in the middle of the night, and incredibly they didn't lose a single ship or a single man in the crossing. They arrived off the Gallic coast the next morning. It's hard to know if Caesar had started this expedition with ambitions to occupy the island, but if he did, those ambitions were long gone. As we've seen, the logistics alone were a nightmare. Over the next few years, Rome's new allies on Britain quietly let their alliances lapse, and Rome pretended not to notice. The island reverted back to the status quo, and the Romans would not return for 100 years.
Close to that. There were other outreaches to Britain, but no formal military invasions. That won't happen again until, even under Augustus, he sent expeditions over to scout out Britain, and several other later emperors. But we don't get another serious invasion of Britain until Claudius. So yeah, about 100 years later. So Claudius would have been what? It was Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, and then Claudius. So yeah, about 4 or 5 generations later.
When Caesar arrived back on the mainland, he split his army and wintered his legions with a bunch of different tribes. A bunch with the Belgae, a bunch on the Rhine, basically all the problem areas. This looks an awful lot like an occupation, and I'm sure it was starting to feel like one.
Yeah.
Something was brewing in Gaul. Earlier in the year, when a rebellious Gallic leader was facing execution by Roman soldiers, his last words had been a defiant rallying cry. "I am a free man, living in a free state." This sentiment was quietly taking hold across the whole region.
Yep.
The tribes were still independent, but just saying that out loud was becoming a political act. Caesar had no way of knowing this, but Gaul was sitting on a knife's edge, and all it needed to descend into total chaos was a little push.
Yep, that's coming. Gaul has been quiet, but it's about to change. So we'll be back next week to find out what happens next. Till then, see you all later. Bye-bye.